The millionaire's mute daughter hadn't spoken a single word until a beggar crossed her path. In a single glance, something inside her awoke and years of silence began to crumble. Her father tried to drive him away, but every word spoken was a scream against control and appearances. Thus, an invisible man transformed the empire's heiress and exposed the true misery of that mansion. The afternoon sun cast golden outlines on the mirrored windows of the Millennium Tower, the most imposing building on Park Avenue, the financial heart of New York City. On the 50th floor, Edward Morrison observed the city he had helped transform with his investments, an empire built in 20 years, ever since he left Albany, New York, with just an idea and immense determination. Now at 52, he commanded Morrison Developments, responsible for the country's most luxurious ventures. In the reflection of the armored glass, his eyes met the photo on the rosewood desk, him and Beatrice, his only daughter, on a boat trip in the Hamptons. The girl smiled, her brown hair fluttering in the wind. The last time he had heard her laugh. "Sir, the video conference with the Chinese investors starts in 5 minutes, announced Martha, his executive secretary interrupting his thoughts. "Confirm my presence and cancel dinner with the mayor. I'm going home early today." The secretary hesitated, surprised. Edward Morrison never cancelled appointments, especially with authorities, but his expression left no room for questions. 40 minutes later, his private chauffeur parked the armored BMW in front of the electronic gate of the mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. The house, designed by a renowned Japanese architect, seemed to float on the 5,000-square-meter plot. Water mirrors, contemporary sculptures, and a Zen garden composed the minimalist landscape. "Good evening, sir," greeted the security guard. "Any special instructions for today?" "Where is Beatrice?" Edward asked, ignoring the greeting. "The girl is in the art studio, sir. Mrs. Constance is with her." Edward crossed the main hall and followed the east corridor of the mansion. He heard the sound of brushes against the canvas even before reaching the door. Mrs. Constance, the housekeeper who had been with Beatrice since her birth, organized paints while the girl, now 14, painted with almost surgical precision. "She's been like this since lunch," said Constance, a 60-year-old woman with grey hair always pulled back in a neat bun. "She didn't want to rest today." Edward observed his daughter. Beatrice was the living image of Clarice, his late wife. The same delicate features, the same intense gaze. She wore paint-stained denim overalls, her feet bare, her hair tied in a messy ponytail. Concentrated on her art, she hadn't even noticed her father's presence. "What is she painting this time?" "It looks like the same as always. A face without details. Just outlines." Edward approached slowly. On the canvas, an oval face without eyes, nose, or mouth. Just an empty silhouette surrounded by shades of blue. The psychologist said these were manifestations of trauma, Beatrice's way of expressing the void. "Dr. Renee called," Constance informed, lowering her voice. "She suggested a new therapeutic approach. Something experimental. A specialized center in Vienna." Edward sighed. They had already tried the world's best specialists, neurologists in Boston, behavioral therapists in London, alternative treatments in Japan, exams, diagnoses, theories. 6 years of absolute silence. 6 years since the accident on the ranch, when Beatrice witnessed what she should never have seen. "Beatrice," Edward called, gently touching his daughter's shoulder. The girl turned, her brown eyes meeting her father's for a fleeting instant, a brief recognition, before returning to her painting. Her slender fingers held the brush firmly, applying layers of cobalt blue paint around the faceless figure. "I'll arrange a video conference with this doctor from Vienna," Edward said, stepping away. "Keep her occupied. I'll be back after dinner." Constance waited until his footsteps disappeared down the corridor. "He's trying, you know," she said to Beatrice, tucking a strand of hair that had fallen across the girl's face. "In his own way, but he is." Beatrice put down the brush and picked up a notepad. With a purple gel pen, she wrote in neat letters, "He only tries what can be bought." The housekeeper read it and shook her head. "Your father believes everything has a solution, dear. It's his way of showing he cares." Beatrice wrote again, "He doesn't listen. He only talks." Constance sighed. Beatrice's silence hid a wisdom that few adults possessed. An old soul in a young body, she often thought. The rest of the evening unfolded in the mansion's usual routine, dinner served at the exact time, the service staff moving discreetly through the rooms, Edward in video conferences in his office. Beatrice had dinner in her room, watching art documentaries. Constance, as always, stayed by her side. At 9 o'clock, after taking the prescribed medications to help her sleep, Beatrice sat by the panoramic window of her room. From there, she could see the lights of the city her father had helped build. New York City, a jungle of concrete and glass that never slept. So noisy outside, so silent within her. She opened her secret diary, the only place where she allowed herself to be truly herself. A hardcover notebook Constance had given her for her 12th birthday. There she wrote about what she couldn't say, about the void that consumed her inside, about the noises that still haunted her, about loneliness. Today I counted the silences, she wrote, 27 between breakfast and lunch, 32 between lunch and dinner. No one notices that the loudest noise is the one unheard. She closed the diary and hid it in the false bottom of her sock drawer. She lay down, observing her bedroom ceiling, where small lights emulated a starry sky, Edward's attempt to bring some magic into her world. But the fake stars only reminded Beatrice that everything there was manufactured, artificial, including love. Outside, New York City continued its frantic pace. Inside the Morrison mansion, the silence was almost palpable, a silence that screamed truths no one was willing to hear. The New York City rain fell relentlessly that Thursday, turning the avenues into surging rivers. In the Mercedes struggling along 10th Avenue, Beatrice watched the drops slide down the armored window, forming ephemeral designs that only she seemed to notice. Beside her, Mrs. Constance checked her watch. "This traffic will delay your appointment with the speech therapist," she said, concerned. "How your father was very specific about the times." Beatrice merely shrugged. It had been 6 years of fruitless therapies. What did 20 minutes of delay matter? She scribbled something on her pad and showed it to the housekeeper. Another wasted hour. "Don't say that, dear. Dr. Renee is one of the best in the country." The car stopped abruptly. Ahead, a broken traffic light and a fallen tree completely blocked the road. The chauffeur, Joshua, who had served the family for over a decade, turned around. "Mrs. Constance, we'll have to detour. This will delay us at least half an hour." "Call the clinic and inform them of the delay," Constance ordered, "and try to find an alternative route." Joshua maneuvered the car, turning into a side street in Jersey City, New Jersey. The area, though close to the luxurious Greenwich, Connecticut, where the Morrison mansion was located, presented a very different reality. Popular commerce, simpler buildings, ordinary people rushing to escape the rain. It was when the car stopped in another traffic jam that Beatrice saw him, a small square, one of those that stubbornly resisted the metropolis's uncontrolled urbanization. Under the precarious shelter of an awning, a man played the guitar, seemingly indifferent to the storm. Around him, a few people formed a small improvised audience. Something about that scene captured Beatrice's attention. Perhaps it was the incongruity, music amidst the chaos of the storm, or perhaps it was the man's face, with marked features and an unshaven beard, but with a genuine smile that seemed to light up the surroundings. He wasn't playing for anyone specific, he just played as if the music were an end in itself. The car moved slowly, but Beatrice turned in her seat, keeping her eyes fixed on the scene until it disappeared from her sight. "What is it, dear?" Constance asked, noticing the girl's unusual interest. Beatrice pointed back, but the car had already left the square behind. The teenager picked up her pad and quickly drew. A man with a guitar surrounded by small strokes that suggested music in the air. "A street musician?" Constance inquired, surprised by Beatrice's sudden interest. "Did you like the music?" Beatrice nodded, her eyes shining in a way Constance hadn't seen in a long time. There was a spark there, something that the expensive therapies and renowned specialists had failed to awaken. The appointment at the speech therapy clinic proceeded like all previous ones, repetitive exercises, frustrated attempts, clinical notes. Dr. Renee was patient and competent, but Beatrice's silence seemed impenetrable. It wasn't a physical issue. All exams proved her vocal apparatus was perfectly healthy. It was something deeper, a psychological barrier no one had been able to overcome. Throughout the return home, Beatrice remained restless. Her eyes scanned the streets as if searching for something, or someone. When they passed near the same square, the disappointment on her face was evident. when she realized the musician was no longer there. That night, for the first time in years, Beatrice refused to take her sleeping medication. Sitting on her bed, she compulsively drew in her notebook. The man with the guitar from different angles in different positions. There was an almost feverish obsession in her strokes. "You need to rest," Constance insisted. Concerned about the girl's unusual agitation, Beatrice wrote on the pad, "I want to go back to that square tomorrow. Your father won't authorize a change in routine without a reason. Don't tell him, please." The request, so simple and yet so complex, put Constance in a delicate position. In 15 years working for Edward Morrison, she had never disobeyed a direct order. But she had also never seen Beatrice show so much interest in something or someone. "We'll see what I can do," she replied evasively, adjusting the covers. "Now rest." The next morning, Constance made a decision that could cost her job. She convinced Joshua to make a detour after Beatrice's physical therapy session, claiming they needed to buy specific material for the girls' school project. The chauffeur, though suspicious, did not question it. After all, Mrs. Constance was the only person Edward fully trusted when it came to his daughter. The square was sunny that day, a stark contrast to the previous storm. Sitting on the same bench, the man strummed soft melodies on his worn-string guitar. A small cardboard box in front of him contained a few coins and bills. He wore simple but clean clothes, faded jeans, a plaid shirt with sleeves rolled up to the elbows, scuffed sneakers. "Wait here," Constance told Joshua. "We'll just take a look and be right back." As they approached, Beatrice seemed simultaneously anxious and wary. The man looked up when the two stopped a few feet away. His deep brown eyes fixed on Beatrice's for a moment, and a spontaneous smile lit up his sun-weathered face. "Good afternoon," he greeted, interrupting the melody. "Did you come to hear some music?" Constance hesitated, unsure how to introduce Beatrice. "This young lady saw you playing yesterday and was interested." "Is that so?" The man smiled more broadly. "Do you like music?" he asked Beatrice directly. The girl nodded shyly. "My name is Claude," he introduced himself. "Claude Spencer." "And you?" "I'm Constance. And this is Beatrice." "Beatrice?" he repeated, as if savoring the name. "Beautiful name." "It suits you." He resumed the melody, a classic by Tom Jobim, his fingers skillfully gliding over the strings. There was something mesmerizing in the way he played, a mix of refined technique and pure passion that seemed to contradict his simple appearance. "Do you play professionally?" Constance asked, genuinely curious. Claude laughed, a deep, pleasant sound. "I used to a long time ago. In another life. Today I play for myself, and for anyone who wants to listen, of course." Beatrice took a step forward, her eyes fixed on Claude's hands. He noticed her interest and, without interrupting the melody, moved over a little on the bench. "Want to sit?" he invited. "The view is better from here." After an approving glance from Constance, Beatrice shyly sat beside the musician. Up close she could see the calluses on his fingers, the small wrinkles around his eyes when he smiled, the unshaven beard that framed a face that, despite being hardened by time, held a serene expression. "Do you play an instrument, Beatrice?" he asked without stopping the music. Constance intervened. "Beatrice doesn't—" "She hasn't spoken." "For some years." Claude nodded, showing no surprise or embarrassment. "Music is also a form of expression," he said simply. "Sometimes more powerful than words." He switched to a softer melody, almost a lullaby. Beatrice watched, fascinated, the movement of his fingers on the strings. Without realizing it, she began to gently sway her head to the rhythm of the music. A small gesture, almost imperceptible, but one that did not go unnoticed by Constance. It was the first time in years the girl had reacted this way to an external stimulus. "We have to go," Constance said, checking her watch. "Your father will be home early today." Beatrice made a move to protest, but held back. She picked up her pad and quickly wrote something, handing it to Claude. "Your music is beautiful. Can I come back?" Claude read it and smiled. "This park is public, Beatrice, and I'm here almost every day except when it rains too much. You're welcome whenever you want." On the way back to the mansion, Beatrice seemed transformed. There was a sparkle in her eyes, an energy in her movements that contrasted with her usual apathy. Constance knew she had crossed a line, but Beatrice's state justified the risk. For the first time in a long time, there was hope. Not a word about this to your father, understood? Constance advised. For now it will be our little secret. Beatrice nodded, a small smile forming at the corner of her lips. In her notebook, she began to draw Claude's face again, but this time with much more detail. And for the first time, the face in her drawing had eyes, a nose, and a mouth. The following weeks established a new clandestine routine. 3 times a week, after therapy sessions, Constance and Beatrice would make a detour to Van Voorst Park, as they began to call it. Joshua, the chauffeur, had become a silent accomplice to these meetings, especially after seeing how Beatrice returned transformed from them, more alive, more present. Claude was always there, sitting on the same bench under the shade of an almond tree, sometimes playing, sometimes just observing the movement in the park, but always with a genuine smile when he saw Beatrice approaching. During one of these meetings, in early October, Claude brought a gift, a small, handmade sheet music notebook with a leather cover. It's for you to record your impressions of the music, he explained, handing it to Beatrice. You don't need to know musical notation. You can draw what you feel when you hear each melody. The girl accepted the gift with wide eyes, running her fingers over the texture of the leather. This was the first gift she had received, without therapeutic pretense in years. It wasn't a new imported device, nor an experimental medication. It was just a notebook, but loaded with meaning. I made a special tea today, Claude said, taking a thermos from the worn backpack he always carried. Chamomile with mint from my small garden. He poured the tea into disposable cups for the 3 of them. Constance, who initially maintained a watchful posture during the meetings, now allowed herself to relax a little. There was something about Claude that inspired trust, perhaps the direct way he spoke, without pretense or circumlocution, or perhaps the way he treated Beatrice, neither with the excessive caution of doctors, nor with the veiled impatience of her father, but with a refreshing naturalness. You mentioned you were a professional musician before, Constance commented, watching Beatrice leaf through the new notebook. What happened? Claude took a sip of tea before answering. I was a music professor at the City University of New York, QUNY, for almost 20 years. Classical guitar, music theory, composition. I had a life that many would consider successful, stable career, academic recognition, performances at international festivals. He paused, looking at the horizon, where the buildings of New York City rose against the October sky. And then I realized I was playing less and less for real people and more for resumes and academic papers. Music had become a career, not a passion. It took a midlife crisis for me to understand that I wanted to return to my roots. So you just dropped everything? Constance asked, incredulous. Not overnight. It was a process. First I took a leave of absence, then I took early retirement. I sold my apartment and bought a smaller, simpler place. Now I give private lessons to a few selected students and play where and when I want. And you don't regret it? Claude smiled. Every day and no day. Depends on when you ask. Beatrice, who seemed absorbed in her new notebook, suddenly looked up and pointed to the guitar. It was a silent request that Claude had already learned to interpret. He picked up the instrument and began to play a soft melody, a composition of his own that never had a name, but which Beatrice particularly adored. As he played, Claude carefully observed the girl's reactions. He had noticed a pattern. Certain notes, certain chords seemed to awaken something in her. When the melody reached a certain cadence, her eyes sparkled in a special way, and her fingers tapped almost imperceptibly against her leg. It was during one of these impromptu music sessions that it happened. In the midst of a particularly emotional passage, Beatrice made a sound. It wasn't exactly a word, not even a well-formed syllable, but a melodic murmur, as if she were trying to follow the melody. Constance froze, her eyes wide. Claude, realizing the delicate moment, continued playing without interruption, with only a slight smile at the corner of his lips. He instinctively knew that drawing attention to that moment could make Beatrice retract. On the way back home, Constance could barely contain her excitement. "Do you realize what happened today?" she said, holding Beatrice's hands. "You made a sound, dear. A musical sound." Beatrice seemed confused, as if she wasn't fully aware of what she had done. She picked up her pad and wrote, "I just felt the music." "Yes, but you expressed it with your voice, not just with drawings or gestures." "It's a start, Beatrice. A wonderful start. That night, lying in her bed, Beatrice tried to reproduce the sound she had made in the park. It wasn't as if she had forgotten how to speak. Her brain perfectly knew the mechanism, the necessary muscles, the coordination. It was more as if a door had been locked and the key lost. But today, for a brief moment, that door had cracked open. Over the following days, the meetings with Claude gained a new purpose. It wasn't just music now, it was therapy, in the purest sense of the word. Claude, with his keen intuition honed by years of teaching, began to incorporate vocal elements into the melodies, encouraging Beatrice to accompany him, first with simple vocalizations, then with isolated syllables. Edward Morrison, however, remained oblivious to this evolution. Immersed in an important negotiation to expand his business abroad, he spent less and less time at home. When present, he limited himself to asking about medical reports and school evaluations. His daughter's silence had become for him a problem to be managed, not a person to be understood. Until, on a Friday morning, the inevitable happened. Edward decided to surprise Beatrice, cancelling his meetings to personally accompany her to her speech therapy session. He wanted to talk to Dr. Renee about a new experimental treatment he had read about in a scientific magazine. "Where is Beatrice?" he asked the housekeeper, arriving home earlier than usual. Constance felt her blood run cold. "She went out with Joshua for therapy, sir. As usual on Fridays." "Excellent. I'll meet them there." "What's the address again?" The housekeeper hesitated, panic rising in her chest. That particular Friday, Beatrice did not have a speech therapy session. It was one of the days set aside for the secret meeting with Claude. "Actually, sir, today is the music therapy session, not speech therapy. It's on Bleecker Street near the—" "Music therapy?" Edward frowned. "I don't recall authorizing that. It was Dr. Renee's recommendation a few weeks ago. You signed the authorization. Perhaps you don't recall with so many commitments." The improvised lie sounded weak even to Constance's own ears. Edward stared at her suspiciously. "I want that therapist's phone number now." "He doesn't answer during sessions, sir." "Office policy." "Then give me the exact address." "I'm going there." Cornered, Constance saw no way out. Providing a false address would only postpone the inevitable. Edward would discover the truth as soon as he arrived at the non-existent location. "Sir, I need to be honest with you," she said, gathering all her courage. "Beatrice is not in a formal therapy session today. She is in Van Vorst Park with a musician." Edward's face transformed into a mask of contained fury. "A musician? What kind of joke is this, Constance? My daughter, under your care, is with a stranger in a public park. Without my authorization." "He's not just any stranger, sir. He's a former music professor, and Beatrice has made remarkable progress with him. She made sounds, sir, vocalizations, for the first time in 6 years." The revelation seemed to momentarily destabilize Edward, but anger soon regained control. "Address now." 20 minutes later, Edward's Porsche screeched to a halt near Van Vorst Park. His eyes swept the area until he found what he was looking for: his daughter, sitting on a bench next to a middle-aged man with a guitar. He approached with long strides, his face contorted in a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Beatrice," he called, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. The girl looked up, panic etched in her eyes. Claude, realizing the situation, gently put his guitar aside and stood up. "You must be Beatrice's father," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Claude Spencer." Edward ignored the extended hand. "I don't know who you are, and frankly, I don't care. I'm taking my daughter out of here right now. And as for you," he said, turning to Joshua, who was observing the scene from a distance, "you're fired. Hand over the car keys and clear out your locker today." Beatrice stood up, clutching her sheet music notebook to her chest. Her eyes, filled with tears, pleaded with her father. "Mr. Morrison," Claude tried again, his voice calm in contrast to the tension of the moment, "I know this must seem irregular, but your daughter has made significant progress. If you'll allow me to explain—" "Explain?" Edward laughed humorlessly. "What is there to explain? You are a stranger who, for some obscure reason, is spending time with a vulnerable teenager, without the knowledge or consent of her legal guardian. Do you know what that's called? A crime. Father." The word came out so low, so tremulous, that for a moment Edward thought he had imagined it. But the shock on Claude's face confirmed it. Beatrice had spoken. A single word pronounced with difficulty, but unequivocally clear. "What did you say?" Edward asked, his anger momentarily replaced by astonishment. Beatrice opened her mouth, tried again, but the moment had passed. Fear had regained control, sealing her lips once more. Edward grabbed his daughter's arm, pulling her away from Claude. "This ends here," he declared. "If you approach my daughter again, I'll call the police." On the way back home, the silence in the car was deafening. Beatrice cried silently in the back seat, clinging to the sheet music notebook as if it were a lifeline. Edward, behind the wheel, alternated between fury at the betrayal and perplexity at what he had witnessed. His daughter had spoken, a single word directed at him, after 6 years of absolute silence. Upon arriving at the mansion, Constance waited at the entrance, her face pale with worry. "Pack your things," Edward said coldly as he passed her. "You're fired." "Sir, please," the housekeeper pleaded, following him down the corridor. "I did what I did for Beatrice's good. She's responding. She's progressing. Don't destroy that out of pride." "Pride?" Edward turned, incredulous. "How you betrayed my trust, exposed my daughter to incalculable risks, and still have the audacity to speak of pride. You heard her today, didn't you?" Constance insisted. She spoke. For the first time in 6 years. It wasn't a renowned doctor who achieved that, nor expensive therapy. It was someone who simply treated her as a person, not a patient. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, an internal battle evident in his expression. "You have until the end of the day to leave," he finally said. "And consider yourself lucky you're not facing more serious charges." The news spread with the typical speed of New York City's power circles. Edward Morrison's daughter, the construction magnate, had been seen in a suspicious situation with a stranger. Details varied depending on the interlocutor. For some, it was an unauthorized private tutor. For others, a charlatan promising miraculous cures. For the most sensationalists, some kind of swindler. The truth, as always, was far less spectacular and far more complex. 3 days had passed since the incident in the park. Beatrice had returned to her absolute silence, refusing even to use her pads to communicate. Locked in her room, she spent hours looking out the window or leafing through the sheet music notebook Claude had given her. The only time she showed any reaction was when they tried to take it from her hands. On these occasions, she became almost wild in her resistance. Edward had hired a new housekeeper, Mrs. Regina, a woman in her 60s with impressive credentials and references from equally wealthy families. She was efficient, discreet, and followed the rules to the letter, exactly what Edward believed was necessary after Constance's betrayal. On the morning of the 4th day, while having coffee in his office and reviewing contracts, Edward received a call from Hector Vance, his personal lawyer for over a decade. "Good morning, Edward. I have some information about that. Matter you asked me to investigate." Edward straightened in his chair, suddenly alert. "I'm listening." His full name is Claude Robert Spencer, 58 years old. As he himself said, he was a full professor of music at CUNY for almost 20 years. He took early retirement about 3 years ago, after a leave of absence for health reasons. "What kind of issues?" "Curiously, nothing serious. From what I could gather, he simply gave up. He sold his apartment in Jersey City, donated most of his belongings, and moved to a much more modest place in Bushwick, Brooklyn. He lives on his pension and some private lessons he gives sporadically. Criminal record? None. Not even a traffic ticket in the last 10 years. The man is practically a model citizen." Edward frowned, dissatisfied with the information. Part of him expected, perhaps even wished, to discover something compromising about Claude, something that would fully justify his exacerbated reaction. "There must be something more," he insisted. "No one simply abandons a stable career without a reason." "Well, there is one thing," Hector said, flipping through his notes. "He was married for almost 30 years to a pianist, Marina Spencer. She passed away about 5 years ago, after a long battle with cancer. It was shortly after that he began his life transition, let's say." Edward remained silent for a few moments, digesting the information. "Keep monitoring. I want to know if he tries to contact my daughter in any way." After hanging up, Edward remained motionless, contemplating the view of New York City through his office's large windows. Claude's story bothered him in a way he couldn't precisely define. There was something almost accusatory in the simplicity of that life, as if it were a deliberate counterpoint to his own existence. His thoughts were interrupted by a discreet knock on the door. It was Regina, the new housekeeper. "Excuse me, sir, Dr. Felicity is here for the session with young Beatrice, but—" She hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "But?" "Beatrice refuses to leave her room. I tried to persuade her as you instructed, but she is—" "Well, she's quite adamant." Edward sighed, more irritated with himself than with his daughter. Since the incident, things had only gotten worse. The small spark he had seen in that brief moment in the park, Beatrice's first word in years, had completely extinguished. And deep down, he knew he was responsible for it. "Tell the doctor it won't be possible today. Reschedule for next week." "Yes, sir. And there's one more thing. A lady named Constance is at the gate. She says she needs to deliver something personally to young Beatrice." The name made Edward's muscles tense. "What does she want to deliver?" "She didn't specify, sir. Just insisted it was important." Edward considered sending the former housekeeper away, but something stopped him. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps the growing feeling that he was in some way acting against his daughter's best interests. "Let her in. But I want to be present when she delivers whatever it is." 15 minutes later, Constance was in the main living room, visibly uncomfortable in an environment that had been her workplace for so many years. She carried a small package wrapped in colorful paper. "Thank you for receiving me, sir," she said, her tone respectful, but not submissive. "What do you want to deliver to my daughter?" Constance extended the package. "It's from Claude, an MP3 player, with some recordings he made especially for her, songs she liked, some with vocalizations she was starting to follow. I thought it might help her to not regress." Edward took the package, examining it suspiciously. Why didn't he send it directly? He tried. He left it at the gate twice, but it was refused. "So he asked me to try, knowing that perhaps you would receive me. And why would I do that after what you did?" Constance held his gaze without hesitation. "Because despite everything, you love your daughter. And you know deep down that what we did was helping her." She spoke, Mr. Morrison. She spoke because for the first time in years someone truly listened to her. The words hit Edward like a punch. It was a truth he had been trying to ignore since the incident in the park. "How can I trust you again? How can I be sure this man doesn't have other intentions? You investigated his past, didn't you?" Constance smiled slightly, seeing the surprise on Edward's face. "I've known you long enough to know how you operate, and I'm sure you found nothing compromising. Claude is exactly what he appears to be, a good man who lost a lot and rediscovered purpose by helping others." Edward looked away, uncomfortable with the accuracy of her observation. "Can I at least see Beatrice?" Constance asked, "just to say goodbye properly. 15 years shouldn't end like this." Before Edward could answer, a figure appeared at the living room door. Beatrice, pale and with pronounced dark circles under her eyes, watched the scene with a mixture of surprise and hope in her gaze. "Beatrice," Constance exclaimed, her eyes welling up. "How are you, my dear?" The girl ran to embrace the former housekeeper, a gesture so spontaneous and emotional that it took Edward by surprise. For a moment he felt like an intruder in his own home, witnessing a connection he himself had never managed to establish with his daughter. "I brought something for you," Constance said, pointing to the package in Edward's hands. "It's from Claude." Beatrice looked at her father, a silent question in her eyes. In a gesture that surprised himself, Edward extended the package to his daughter. "It's yours. You can open it." With trembling hands, Beatrice unwrapped the gift. It was a simple MP3 player, with headphones and a small handwritten note. "To continue our musical journey. The words are inside waiting for you, Claude." While Beatrice examined the gift, Edward made an impulsive decision. "Constance, I need you to do me a favor." The former housekeeper looked at him, surprised. "A favor, sir?" "I want you to arrange a meeting between the three of us, me, Beatrice, and this Claude, on neutral ground. A coffee, perhaps." "That's unexpected, sir." "Perhaps, but it's necessary. I need to understand what's happening. And maybe—" He hesitated, looking at his daughter, who was now putting on the headphones. "Maybe I need to learn to listen too." The next morning, Edward cancelled all his meetings and drove personally to a small cafe in Greenwich Village. Beatrice sat beside him, alternating between anxiety and excitement. It was the first time in years he had seen her display so much emotion. Claude was already waiting for them, sitting at a discreet table in the back of the establishment. Seeing them, he stood up, his face revealing a mixture of apprehension and hope. "Mr. Morrison, Beatrice," he greeted, indicating the empty chairs. "Thank you for coming." Edward studied the man in front of him. Under normal circumstances, he would never cross paths with someone like Claude. His social and professional circles were meticulously selected, composed of people who shared his status and worldview. There was something disconcerting about the man's direct simplicity. No flattery, no excessive nervousness in the face of his position. "Let's get straight to the point," Edward said, maintaining the business tone he used in difficult negotiations. "I want to understand exactly what you're doing with my daughter, and why." "It's quite simple, really," Claude replied, undeterred. "I'm just offering her what we all need. A space to be heard without judgment or expectations. Music is just the vehicle, not the goal." "And what do you gain from this?" The question hung in the air for a few seconds. Claude took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Purpose, perhaps. After my wife passed, I lost my way for a while. Music, which had always been our connection, became painful. Teaching in formal settings seemed empty, mechanical. It was only when I started playing in parks for anyone who wanted to listen that I rediscovered joy. And when I met Beatrice," he looked fondly at the girl, "I realized there was something special there. A sensitive soul that needed expression, not fixing." "She needs proper treatment," Edward insisted, though with less conviction. "From qualified professionals, not improvised sessions in a park." "With all due respect, Mr. Morrison, she had access to the world's best specialists for 6 years, didn't she?" "And what was the result?" Edward had no answer to that. The medical reports, the therapeutic evaluations, the cautious prognoses, none of it had produced what a simple afternoon in the park had, making Beatrice speak, even if only one word. "I'm not suggesting abandoning conventional treatments," Claude continued, softening his tone. "I'm just proposing a complementary approach, something that goes beyond protocols and diagnoses." Beatrice, who had been attentively observing the dialogue, suddenly picked up her pad and wrote something, pushing the paper towards her father. "He really listens to me. He doesn't try to fix me." The simple words hit Edward with unexpected force. How many times in the last 6 years had he truly listened to his daughter? Not just heard reports about her, not just checked her clinical progress, but truly listened to her as a person. "Can you explain exactly what you do with her?" he asked, his tone now more curious than accusatory. Claude smiled, noticing the subtle change. "We started with pure music. Simple melodies, basic rhythms. I observed what made her react, what sparked her interest. I noticed that certain harmonic progressions seemed to connect with her on a deeper level. Then I started introducing vocal elements, first just hummed melodies, then simple syllables she could try to reproduce without the pressure of formal language. And she responded. Yes, gradually. First with gestures, then with sounds, eventually with an attempt at a word. The important thing was not perfection, but the freedom to try without fear of failure." Edward turned to his daughter. "Is this what you want, Beatrice? To continue seeing this, Claude?" The answer came not on paper but in a gesture. Beatrice extended her hand, hesitantly touching her father's arm, and nodded with an intensity that spoke more than any word could. At that moment, sitting in an ordinary cafe he normally wouldn't frequent, talking to a man who represented everything he was not, Edward Morrison made a decision that would change the course of their lives. "We'll try," he finally said, "with some conditions, of course." The relief on Beatrice's face was like a ray of sunshine breaking through heavy clouds, and for the first time in a long time Edward felt that maybe, just maybe, he was doing something truly right as a father. The agreement established between Edward and Claude was meticulously structured, like every contract the businessman signed. Sessions would take place 3 times a week, always at the Morrison mansion, in a room specially adapted for musical activities. Constance would be rehired to supervise the meetings, and weekly reports would be sent to Beatrice's medical team. The new music room, installed in record time in the mansion's former sunroom, was a spacious and bright area with impeccable acoustics. Edward spared no expense. High-quality instruments, professional recording equipment, shelves filled with rare sheet music. Everything money could buy to facilitate the process. Claude, upon seeing the space for the first time, merely smiled discreetly. "Impressive," he commented, "but we'll only need my old guitar and Beatrice's willingness." It was a simple observation, with no trace of explicit criticism, but it made Edward feel strangely inadequate. Once again, he faced the disconcerting feeling that the professor saw through his tendency to turn everything into a matter of material resources. The first sessions were tense, with Edward insisting on staying in the room, observing every movement, every interaction. His presence clearly inhibited Beatrice, who was more withdrawn than she had been in the parks. After the third session, without significant progress, Constance finally intervened. "Sir, with all due respect," she said when they were alone, "your presence is hindering the process. The girl feels evaluated, not welcomed. She's my daughter, Constance. I have the right to be present." "Certainly, but perhaps you could follow through the recordings, at least initially, until she feels more comfortable." Reluctantly, Edward agreed, and it was only then, without the pressure of her father's gaze, that Beatrice began to progress again. First, with simple vocalizations, then with isolated syllables, eventually forming hesitant words. "Yes. No. Water." Basic words pronounced with difficulty, but representing a monumental advance. The medical team, initially skeptical of the unconventional approach, began to show interest in the results. Dr. Renee, the speech therapist, who had been with Beatrice for years, requested permission to observe a session. "It's fascinating," she commented afterward, in a meeting with Edward. "He created an environment where speech emerges naturally as a consequence of musical expression, not as the primary goal. This bypasses the psychological barrier that prevents Beatrice from speaking in conventional contexts." "So you believe this can really work?" Edward asked, still divided between hope and skepticism. "It's already working, Mr. Morrison. The progress of the last few weeks surpasses everything we achieved in years of traditional therapy. I strongly recommend its continuation." As the weeks passed, a subtle transformation began to occur not only in Beatrice but in the mansion itself. The environment, once antiseptically perfect and silent, began to have moments of spontaneous music. Occasionally, laughter could be heard echoing through the corridors. Staff who had served the family for years discreetly commented among themselves about the change in atmosphere. Edward, contrary to his usual tendencies, began to reorganize his schedule to be more present at home. Initially, he justified to himself that it was just to monitor his daughter's progress, but gradually a deeper truth emerged. He was rediscovering his own daughter, and in a way himself. It was during dinner on an ordinary Wednesday, about 2 months after the sessions began, that Beatrice surprised everyone. Edward was talking about a new development project when she interrupted him. "Father," she said, her voice still hesitant but clear, "can I speak?" The silence that followed was almost palpable. Edward stared at his daughter, momentarily speechless. "Of course, Beatrice, always. I wanted to ask about Mom." The mention of Clarice made Edward's heart tighten. It was a subject carefully avoided in the house since the tragedy. What do you want to know?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. What was her voice like? The question, so simple and yet so complex, caught Edward off guard. For a moment he was transported back in time, to the days when Clarice's crystalline laughter filled that same dining room. "It was musical," he finally replied. "Melodious, even when she was just talking, and when she sang." His voice faltered slightly. It was as if the world stopped to listen. Beatrice nodded slowly, absorbing the information like a precious treasure. "She sang. To me. Every night. Ever since you were a baby. Lullabies, folk songs, sometimes even opera arias. She said you had perfect pitch, that you responded differently to each melody." Something changed in Beatrice's gaze. A new understanding, like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. Claude said, "That music holds memories. That sometimes. Our bodies remember what our minds forget." The observation, so profound, coming from a teenager who was barely beginning to speak again, moved Edward in a way he hadn't experienced in years. In that moment, he saw more than his daughter before him. He saw Clarice's legacy alive and breathing. That dinner conversation marked a turning point. In the following days, Beatrice began to ask questions about her mother, small inquiries, fragments of curiosity that had long been suppressed. And Edward, defying years of reluctance to touch on the subject, found himself sharing memories, showing photographs, playing old videos. Claude, when informed of this new dynamic, suggested something bold. Perhaps it's time for Beatrice to hear her mother's voice again, he proposed during one of the weekly evaluation sessions with Edward. Are there any recordings, home videos with music? The question made Edward stand up abruptly, walking to the window to hide his emotional reaction. There are, but I'm not sure if Beatrice is ready for that. The trauma. The trauma came precisely from the forced silence, from the attempt to protect her from difficult emotions, Claude gently observed. Sometimes the path to healing involves facing what we fear most. What if it makes her regress? What if she returns to complete silence? It's a risk, yes, but look how far she has come. Today's Beatrice is stronger than she was 6 months ago. She's finding her voice literally. Perhaps she also needs to find her musical roots. After days of careful consideration and consultations with the medical team, Edward finally agreed. On a Saturday evening, they gathered in the music room. Edward, Beatrice, Claude, and Constance. The businessman held a USB drive he hadn't touched in years, Clarice's last recordings, made during a family trip to Cape May, New Jersey, weeks before the accident. Are you sure you want to do this? He asked Beatrice, giving her one last chance to back out. The girl nodded, her eyes fixed on the small object that contained her mother's voice. Edward inserted the USB drive into the sound system, and after a brief hesitation, pressed play. The room was filled with the soft chords of a guitar, followed by Clarice Morrison's crystalline voice, singing an old Brazilian lullaby. Nana nenê que a cuca vem pegar. Papai foi pra roça, mamãe foi trabalhar. Sleep, baby, or the cuca will get you. Daddy went to the fields, Mommy went to work. Beatrice closed her eyes, her entire body tensing like a guitar string. Silent tears began to stream down her face, but she made no move to stop the recording. Edward watched, torn between the impulse to protect his daughter from pain and the recognition that perhaps this was a necessary pain. When the song ended, an emotion-laden silence hung in the room. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Beatrice began to hum. Hesitantly at first, then with more confidence reproducing the melody she had just heard. Her voice, still fragile from disuse, carried unmistakable echoes of Clarice's timbre. I remember, she finally said, opening her tear-filled eyes. I remember her singing in the yellow room at the beach house. Edward sat beside his daughter, taking her hands in his. Yes, the yellow room in Cape May. You were 8 years old. It was our last trip together. She seemed sad when she sang. Why? The question hit Edward like lightning. Clarice had indeed been different on that trip, more introspective, more melancholic. At the time, he had attributed it to fatigue, to the pressures of her own work as a pianist. But there was something more, something they never fully discussed, because days later, I don't know, daughter, he answered honestly. Your mother sometimes kept thoughts to herself, like you. Beatrice was silent for a few moments, as if processing information long buried in her memory. That day, at the ranch, she finally said, referring to the day of the accident for the first time in 6 years. She said she needed to tell me something important. Edward felt his blood run cold. This was a part of the story he didn't know, what had happened in the moments before the accident, when Clarice had taken Beatrice for a horseback ride around the family ranch in Albany, New York. What did she want to tell you? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. I don't know, she never got to say, because then the horse got scared by the noise and... She stopped, unable to continue. She didn't need to. Edward knew the rest of the story. The horse rearing, Clarice trying to protect her daughter, the fatal fall. Beatrice witnessing everything, helpless. After that, the words just disappeared, Beatrice continued, now speaking with surprising fluency, as if a dam had broken. It was as if my voice had gone with her, as if speaking was, betraying her memory somehow. Claude, who had respectfully stayed in the background, now approached. It's common after trauma for our brains to create such associations. Speech became connected, for you, with loss. So instinctively, you silenced it to avoid more pain. But why now? Edward asked. Why after 6 years is she managing to overcome this? Because she found a safe path back, Claude replied simply. Music created a bridge between silence and speech, and perhaps. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully, perhaps because the time has come for certain truths to be told. Edward frowned, intrigued by the professor's choice of words. What truths? Claude looked meaningfully at Beatrice, who suddenly seemed anxious. When we first met in the park, Beatrice showed me something. A drawing she always carried with her. I thought it was just an artistic creation, but now I understand it might be a memory. Perhaps you should show it to your father, Beatrice. The girl bit her lip, unsure. Then, after a moment of hesitation, she got up and left the room. She returned minutes later with her oldest sketchbook, one Edward had never been able to see, as Beatrice kept it jealously guarded. With trembling hands, she opened it to a specific page and handed it to her father. The drawing showed 2 people in an open field, a long-haired woman, clearly Clarice, and a small girl, Beatrice, at 8 years old. But there was a third figure, partially visible behind a tree, a man observing the scene from a distance. Who is this? Edward asked, pointing to the male figure. Beatrice shook her head. I don't know. He was there at the ranch that day, talking to Mom before the horseback ride. They argued. That's why she was crying when we started riding. Edward stared at the drawing, a cold sensation spreading through his body. Clarice hadn't mentioned meeting anyone at the ranch. In fact, she had explicitly said she wanted to spend the day alone with Beatrice, which was why he had returned to New York City for an important meeting. What was this man like? Do you remember? Tall grey hair. He wore a Panama hat. And he had a mark here. She pointed to her own chin. The description triggered an alarm in Edward's memory. He knew someone like that. Someone with whom Clarice had had a brief relationship in her youth, before meeting him. Someone who had occasionally reappeared over the years, always causing tension when mentioned. I think I know who it might be, he said, his voice altered by the revelation. But why would he be at the ranch? Why would Clarice meet him without telling me? Maybe that's what she wanted to tell me during the ride, Beatrice suggested. Something about this man. Something important. Edward stood up abruptly, his mind filled with unanswered questions. Fragments of past conversations, unexplained behaviors, everything began to form a disturbing mosaic. I need to make some calls, he said, heading for the door. Constance, stay with Beatrice. Claude, I'd like you to stay too. I'll be back shortly. Edward locked himself in his office, his mind buzzing with possibilities. Beatrice's description perfectly matched Richard Avery, a conductor with whom Clarice had studied piano in her youth. The two had a brief but intense relationship, interrupted when she decided to pursue a career as a concert pianist. Instead of remaining in the orchestra, he conducted. Years later, when Clarice was already married to Edward and established as a pianist, Richard reappeared in New York City for a season of concerts. There was a cordial reunion, professional dinners, invitations for collaborations. On the surface, everything seemed appropriate, but Edward had always felt an underlying tension, an unspoken truth that hung in the air when Richard's name was mentioned. With trembling fingers, Edward opened the wall safe and took out a small wooden box. It was where he kept Clarice's personal documents after her passing, certificates, letters, her will. Objects he had never dared to examine in detail, preferring to bury the pain rather than face it. Among the papers, he found an envelope he didn't recognize. Inside, a handwritten letter dated 2 weeks before the accident. Clarice's elegant handwriting filled the page with words he had never read. Edward, if you are reading this, it means I have found the courage to finally share something I have been holding on to for years. I don't know how you will react, and this fear has been my jailer for too long. Richard recently re-entered my life, not by chance. He sought me out with information that changed everything I believed I knew about my own history. Documents about my adoption, details my adoptive parents never shared with me. I discovered I have a sister, Edward, a twin sister from whom I was separated as a baby. Richard met her during a tour in Europe, and noticing the striking resemblance, began to investigate. That's how he found me again. I know I should have shared this with you immediately, but I needed to process, to understand, before bringing this hurricane into our family. I plan to tell you everything after our return from Albany, New York. First to you, then to Beatrice when we were ready. The truth never comes at convenient times, but I can no longer postpone it. We arranged a meeting at the ranch so I could meet my sister for the first time. I ask you to understand my need to do this, even knowing how you feel about Richard. With all my love, Clarice. Edward let the letter fall onto the desk, stunned. He had never received it. Clarice had probably written it but hadn't had a chance to deliver it before the accident. And the meeting mentioned, would it have occurred precisely on the fateful day? He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years, praying it was still active. After several rings, a deep, slightly hoarse voice answered. Hello? Richard? It's Edward Morrison. A long silence followed on the other end of the line. Edward, I never thought I'd hear your voice again. We need to talk about what happened at the ranch 6 years ago. Another silence, this one even heavier. I thought this day would never come, Richard finally said. I'm in New York City currently. Can we meet? 2 hours later, Edward entered a discreet cafe in the West Village. Richard was already waiting for him at a back table, still imposing at 70, with the same Panama hat Beatrice had described, the same scar on his chin. Thank you for coming, Richard said, standing briefly for a formal greeting. I didn't come out of courtesy, Edward replied, sitting down. I came for answers. Richard nodded as if expecting exactly that approach. Where should I begin? Twice to my fiferners and for safety, with the truth. Were you at the ranch the day Clarice had the accident? Yes, I was. But not alone. Edward felt his heart race. Clarice's sister. Richard raised his eyebrows, genuinely surprised. So you know? I just found out. Clarice left a letter she never delivered to me. I see. Richard took a sip of his coffee. Yes, Helen was with me. Clarice's twin sister, separated in childhood, one adopted in the US, the other in Portugal. One of those real-life dramas that seem like fiction. What happened that day? Richard took a deep breath, as if preparing to relive a painful memory. The meeting wasn't as we expected. Helen was nervous, Clarice emotional. We talked for almost an hour on the main house's veranda. Beatrice was playing in the garden, far enough away not to hear. Or so we thought. He paused, adjusting his hat on the table. At a certain point, Helen revealed she was sick, very sick, advanced cancer, only a few months to live. She wanted to meet her sister before she passed, but she also wanted to meet her niece. To know that a part of her would continue in the world through Beatrice. Edward felt a lump in his throat. He imagined Clarice facing the devastating news of finding and losing a sister almost simultaneously. Clarice was distraught, Richard continued. She left saying she needed air, that she would ride for a bit to organize her thoughts. Beatrice followed her, asking to go along. Helen and I stayed in the house, waiting for their return to continue the conversation. But they never came back, Edward finished. His voice choked. Richard nodded heavily. When we heard the staff's screams, we ran to the stable. It was already too late. Helen went into shock. I tried to handle the situation, but when you arrived hours later, I thought it best to distance myself. You never liked me, and in that moment of pain, my presence would only complicate things. You should have told me, Edward said, contained anger in his voice. About Helen, about everything. I should have, yes, but I respected Clarice's wish to be the one to tell you. And then, when everything happened, well, Helen no longer wanted any contact. The loss of her sister so soon after finding her was too devastating. Is she still... Edward hesitated, unable to complete the question. No, Helen passed away 8 months later, exactly as her doctors had predicted. Silence weighed between the two men, each lost in their own reflections on fate and its cruel coincidences. Why are you telling me this now? Edward finally asked. Why did you agree to meet me after all these years? Richard looked him directly in the eyes. Because I've carried this weight with me ever since. The guilt of not speaking, of respecting secrets that perhaps should have been revealed, and because I heard that Beatrice is finally speaking again. Edward frowned, surprised. How do you know that? New York City is smaller than it seems, Edward. I have mutual friends in your social circle. When I found out, I thought perhaps it was time for all truths to come to light. So she can truly heal. So everyone can. Edward looked out the cafe window, watching the movement of the city that never stopped. He thought of Beatrice, of all she had lost and all she could still recover. "Is there anything else I need to know?" he asked, turning back to Richard. The older man hesitated briefly. Helen left something for Beatrice, a diary with stories of her life, photographs, memories she wanted to share with the niece she barely knew. "It's been with me ever since, waiting for the right moment. And you think that moment has arrived? It's not for me to decide. It's for you as a father and for Beatrice, as the inheritor of these stories." Richard took a carefully wrapped brown paper package from his briefcase and placed it on the table. "What you choose to do with this is your decision. But if I may offer a piece of advice, secrets rarely protect those we love. Sooner or later, the truth finds its way." On the way back home, Edward felt as if he carried not only Helen's package, but the weight of 6 years of silences and omissions. How much of Beatrice's suffering could have been avoided if he had simply investigated more, asked more, listened more? Upon arriving at the mansion, he found Beatrice, Claude, and Constance still in the music room. The girl seemed more serene, playing some simple notes on the piano under Claude's patient guidance. "How is she?" Edward asked Constance, observing from the doorway. "Better than we imagined. Talking about that day seems to have released something within her, rather than traumatizing her again." Edward nodded, recognizing the wisdom of the observation. For years he had tried to protect Beatrice by avoiding the subject, when in reality silence only deepened the wounds. "Beatrice," he called softly, entering the room. "Can we talk?" The girl turned, her eyes immediately noticing the package in his hands. There was an intuition in her that always surprised him. "Did you find something?" she asked, her voice now firmer than in previous days. "Yes, and I think you deserve to know the whole truth." In the following hours, in the intimacy of the mansion's library, Edward shared with his daughter everything he had learned about Helen, Clarice's twin sister whom Beatrice never properly knew, about the illness that consumed her, about the meeting at the ranch that should have been the beginning of a family connection, but ended up marked by tragedy. Beatrice listened in attentive silence, occasionally asking questions, processing each new piece of information with a maturity that tugged at Edward's heart. When they finally opened the package left by Helen together, they found a diary filled with photographs, letters, and reflections. On the first page, a simple dedication. "To my niece Beatrice, so she may know the other half of her mother's story. She looked so much like Mom," Beatrice whispered, running her fingers over a photograph where the two sisters, newly reunited, smiled side by side. "They were identical on the outside, but with very different stories," Edward commented. "Helen grew up in Portugal, became a literature professor. She never married or had children. That's why Mom was so upset that day," Beatrice reflected. "It wasn't just about finding her sister, but also about losing her immediately after." "Exactly." Beatrice leafed through a few more pages of the diary, absorbing fragments of the life of an aunt she never truly got to know. Then she looked up at her father, a new determination in her gaze. "I want to talk about this, not just here with you. I want to tell my story." "Our story? What do you mean?" "The charity recital next week at Carnegie Hall. You're the main sponsor, aren't you?" "I want to participate. Not just as a spectator, but as part of the program." Edward blinked, astonished by the suggestion. The recital was a prestigious annual event, bringing together the city's cultural and economic elite to raise funds for educational projects. "Beatrice, it's a big step. Do you really feel ready?" "I don't know if I'm ready," she answered honestly. "But I know I need to do this for me, for Mom, for Helen, and for all the children who need to find their voice." The following week passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Beatrice's inclusion in the recital program was kept secret, known only to a small circle that included Edward, Claude, Constance, and the event's artistic director. Together, they prepared a presentation that combined music and narration, the story of a girl who lost her voice and the journey to find it again. On the night of the recital, Carnegie Hall was packed. Personalities from the business, artistic, and political worlds occupied the red seats of the magnificent venue. Edward, in the main box, felt his heart pound faster than ever before in a multi-million-dollar negotiation. When the presenter announced a special surprise in the program, a murmur ran through the audience. The stage darkened, and when the lights returned, they revealed Beatrice at the piano and Claude with his guitar beside her. "Good evening," she said into the microphone, her soft but surprisingly clear voice echoing through the hall. "My name is Beatrice Morrison. Many here know me as the magnate's mute daughter. For 6 years that was my identity. Today I want to share with you the journey that brought me back to words." An absolute silence fell over the audience as Beatrice began to tell her story, interspersing words and music. She spoke of the accident, her mother's loss, the trauma that had sealed her voice. She spoke of the aunt she never truly got to know, of the truths discovered late, of the well-intentioned secrets that only prolonged her suffering. "I lost my voice because I believed that speaking would mean losing my connection with my mother," she explained, while Claude gently strummed the lullaby Clarice used to sing. "But I discovered that true silence lay in the absence of truth, not in the absence of words." From the box, Edward watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and admiration he had never felt before, not for the musical talent she had clearly inherited from her mother, nor for the courage to perform publicly after years of reclusion, but for the wisdom with which she had transformed her pain into a message of hope. "Today this recital is not just to raise funds for music education," Beatrice continued. "It is to announce the creation of the Clarice and Helen Morrison Institute, a center dedicated to children and adolescents who, for whatever reason, have lost their voice. Whether due to trauma, neurological conditions, or simply because no one stopped to truly listen to them." The audience erupted in spontaneous applause. On stage, Beatrice smiled, not the shy, restrained smile Edward knew, but an open, radiant one full of promise. "At the Institute, the approach will be different from any other. We won't try to fix anyone. We will simply create spaces where each person can find their own form of expression, whether through music, art, or simply the attentive presence of someone willing to listen." Her eyes met her father's in the box. "I learned from my father that material resources are important, yes. But I learned from Claude that the most valuable resource we can offer someone is our ability to be truly present." To conclude the presentation, Beatrice played an original composition, a piano piece that began in minor, almost dissonant tones, and gradually evolved into a hopeful and clear melody. When the last notes dissipated in the air, the entire Carnegie Hall rose in an emotional ovation. Backstage, after the performance, Edward embraced his daughter with an intensity that seemed to want to compensate for 6 years of restrained hugs. "Your mother would be so proud," he whispered in her ear. "And Helen too." "Do you think so?" Beatrice asked, still insecure despite the public triumph. "I'm sure." "And his voice briefly faltered. "I've never been so proud in my entire life." Claude approached discreetly, his guitar already stored in its worn case. "I think my work here is done," he said with a serene smile. "No way," Edward replied, extending his hand. "Your work is just beginning. If you accept, of course, we'll need an artistic director for the Institute." The invitation, as unexpected as it was sincere, took Claude by surprise. "Are you sure? I'm just an old professor who prefers parks to concert halls." "Exactly why," Beatrice interjected. "Because you don't see people as problems to be solved or projects to be managed. You truly listen." In the following weeks, the Morrison mansion underwent physical transformations that reflected the emotional changes of its inhabitants. The East Wing, previously occupied by rarely used rooms, was completely renovated to house the first facilities of the Clarice and Helen Morrison Institute. The initial team included therapists, music educators, and art educators, all selected not only for their credentials, but primarily for their ability to genuinely connect. Claude, initially reluctant to take on a formal position, eventually agreed to coordinate the music program on the condition of maintaining his sessions in public parks. "The Institute cannot become a privileged bubble," he argued. "We need to keep doors and windows open to the real world." Edward, surprising many in his business circle, decided to significantly reduce his professional commitments to dedicate himself to the project. For the first time in his career, he delegated operational control of Morrison developments to his directors, taking on only strategic decisions. Constance, reinstated in her old position with enhanced honors, took over the daily management of the mansion and the institute, her life experience proving as valuable as any academic degree. As for Beatrice, her transformation was the most remarkable of all. The silent girl who hid in inner worlds now spoke with growing confidence, not only at home but in lectures, interviews, and presentations. Her personal story, shared with sensitivity and purpose, inspired other families to seek more human approaches to similar challenges. On a Saturday afternoon, 6 months after the Carnegie Hall recital, Edward observed from the mansion's terrace the garden where children of various ages and conditions now participated in musical activities. Some spoke normally, others used alternative communication, some remained silent, but all were seen, heard, welcomed in their uniqueness. Beatrice approached, carrying 2 cups of tea. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, handing one to her father. "How life comes full circle," Edward replied, accepting the drink. "A year ago, I thought I knew what was best for you, that I could control everything with enough resources, enough doctors, enough therapies. And now, Joyce, now I understand that sometimes we simply need to listen. Even silence, when truly heard, has a lot to say." Beatrice smiled, resting her head on her father's shoulder as they watched Claude organize a small, improvised choir under the almond tree. His voice, gentle but firm, guided the children in a simple song about birds and freedom. "Do you know what else I learned from all this?" Beatrice asked. "What?" "That sometimes we need to lose our voice to discover what we truly want to say." Edward wrapped his daughter in a half-hug, feeling the wisdom of her words. In the garden below, the children's voices rose in imperfect but authentic harmony, some loud and clear, others hesitant, some just whispered but all equally valuable in the symphony they composed together. And in that moment, among the notes rising to the New York City sky, Edward swore he heard distant but distinct echoes of 2 identical voices, Clarice and Helen, singing along with the children, celebrating the transformative power of music, truth, and above all, genuine listening. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope Beatrice's journey resonated in your hearts like a melody that lingers even after the music ends. For more stories that explore the silences and voices that dwell within us all, we have a special playlist waiting for you right here. If this narrative touched your soul, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and share your thoughts in the comments. After all, as Beatrice discovered, our stories come alive when they are truly heard. Until next time.